Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? It's nice to be here. Hey, by the way, I'm part of the committee, but I'm also, you remember those commercials, Hair Club for Men? I'm also the president, but I'm also a client. Well, I'm on the committee, but I'm also a student. First cohort, Global Supply Chain Management, third master's. So I have the pleasure of having Dr. Grace here. She was one of my professors. So it's a real treat to come back and contribute back to this. But thanks for being here. So we're going to talk about supply chain risk. We're going to dive into vendor risk. We're going to talk about financial risk. And we're going to talk about disruption. We'll cover those things, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So as the gentleman was talking earlier, I don't have a French accent. I probably have a Mexican accent. So bear with me a little bit, okay? So let me introduce the panel. I'll start with Mike Mitchell. He's the CEO of Credit Management Association. Good Scott. I refer to him as Good Scott. We have an inside joke. Scott Sterling, he's VP Sales for Experian. Chris, you're VP of Sales also for Credit Risk Management, right?
Credit Safe.
I'm sorry. And Mark Irwin, he's with Southern California Edison. And exactly what is your title?
So I'm a Director of Energy Procurement.
Okay. And we have Dr. Grace Sosic with USC. So it seems like just yesterday I was taking classes from her. Really? 3 pages of written out mathematical equations? I'm serious. She's a PhD in mathematics. So let's get started. Managing supply chain risk and vendor failure. So I always like this image. They say your chain is only as strong as your weakest link. I see this every day. Oh, by the way, I'm Alvin Moreno. I work for Nestle. I'm the Director of Global Supply Chain Credit Risk for Nestle, so I got the whole world. Nestle's a $100 billion company, so our procurement is about north of $60 billion. So basically our sales are concentrated to food and food service, but our suppliers, they cover the horizon. Transportation, warehousing, machinery, commodities, you name it. So as some of the professionals here in risk and business intelligence will tell you, one thing is when you get accustomed to looking at Kroger and a Walmart and a Target, and it's the same industry. Another thing is when I'm looking at a provider of potassium, or a provider of cocoa, or a provider of coffee, or dairies. In late 2014, dairies lost 1/3 of their value. All of a sudden, my suppliers, on the same volume, their revenues dropped by 1/3. So now I'm looking at their financials. Hey, can you weather this? You're highly leveraged. How are you going to cover interest expense? How are you going to basically keep the lights on? So those are the kind of things that we'll dive into. So where does risk hit in the supply chain? Do I take any volunteers in the panel? At what stage in your supply chain do you encounter risk?
Everywhere?
Dr. Gray looks like she wants to jump right in there. Think about it. You're procuring raw materials, you're shipping them, or let's say that you're not even manufacturing something. Are you guys familiar with Hanjin? Okay. Where are those barges right now? You don't need to manufacture. It could be Toyota getting parts in. It could be Kroger or Walmart getting their Halloween shipments. It's a seasonal thing. They can't get their product. Why? Because those barges are floating there because that company went bankrupt. Had you looked at their financials, you would have known that over the past 5 years, they had operating losses, negative working capital, super leveraged, they couldn't make, EBITDA was lower than their interest expense, those are red flags, those are issues. Scott, you think that would have been an issue?
Yeah, you would, absolutely. We talked about it when it came up. A lot of the data that's out there, which makes it even more difficult, is it may not have shown that, right? A lot of the traditional data sources probably would have shown healthy financials, could have shown a credit score if you were getting any kind of international reports through any of the bureaus. So you really have to have a good understanding of how leveraged these accounts, these companies are, and have the process to dig in deep and look. So
I'll pick on Dun & Bradstreet because they're not here,
thank you.
but I know them really well too. So I actually, when I saw Hanjin, I'm like, good Lord, they're not on my scope. Because Nestle has 549,000 vendors worldwide. Okay, that's way too much cheddar to stay on top of, right? So, but when you look at 80% of spend and critical, about 13,000 make up 80% of spend, plus critical. Critical being anything that will stop your production, either in a market or at a zone or globally. Globally, I mean, because, give you an example, we had an IT contract with a very small company, and Nestle was going to use this to govern the purchases of milk worldwide. Well, that's a $6 billion category for Nestle. If that IT system fails, technically we can't buy milk. So, when I went back and I looked at this company, hey, fellas, they only have 24 employees. So we developed contingency strategies. We went ahead with it, but we had contingency strategies in place, like escrowing the source code, very well documented source code. So if anything went wrong, we could transition over to another IT vendor that could quickly fix it. But anyways, I pick on Hanjin because when I saw the notification that they filed, it's like, wait a minute, it's not in my scope, because right now my team is tracking about 9,000 vendors, and we review those annually with the help of these folks here too. So immediately I ran a DMB report. Now, they filed bankruptcy, if I remember correctly, August 31st. I ran the report on September 5th. According to the DMB report, it was stable. You know why? Because they were paying their bills on time all the way up until they filed bankruptcy. But that's not uncommon. So, I said, well, wait a minute, it's a public company. I look at their financials, yeah, they've been losing money over the last 5 years. They had a negative working capital over the last 5 years. They had a liquidity issue over the last 5 years. Highly leveraged. Well, had you looked at it, you would have known you had a problem and a time bomb ready to explode. But anyways, so actually, I'll talk about, why don't I pick on you, Chris?
Please do.
How would you go about, or actually, let me go to the next slide. Why do you think it's important to manage, or at least take a look at your vendors? I mean, we look at quality, compliance, sustainability, safety, but why do you think it's important to look at your financial composition of your vendors?
Well, I mean, as you said before, if you are doing business with someone, God forbid something happens to them, is that going to impact your business, how you deliver your goods to your customers? It throws a kink in the whole process.
Scott?
One simple word, disruption, right? So you just want to avoid disruption. So I worked for Xerox Corp for about 20 years before working for Experian. I helped run their global consulting group in LA. We had contracts with a lot of major clients. We had a technology partner in Europe producing one little component of some motherboards for some of our products. We had County of LA for anybody who works for County of LA knows that I think that is I think the revenue for County of LA is equivalent to most states and some countries in the world. So we had very large contracts with them, and we weren't able to move product. There was about a 6-month delay, in which case we lost some contracts, and that was just LA. So imagine just my company in North America. I think they thought that 6-month period was a $7.2 million hit to top line. I think we had 40% margin. It's a lot of money. And that was just on that one motherboard on that one product in that one time period. So that's just an example of why it's important to manage your vendors. Currently with Experian, the reason I came over to Experian is I handle the high-tech sector, and so we have a client up in Seattle. There's a couple up there. Some are in the room, but somebody that's not here, another company in Seattle, they actually automated this process, and they set up a portal so that vendors and suppliers could self-vet. So they basically set up a web page. You want to sell for us or supply for us? They made them go in there, fill out their information. This, it would feed over to companies like you have up here. We would vet them out. They would pay the price. That high-tech company didn't have to pay. And so it really, from the very inception, helped kind of make sure that you had clean, reputable vendors and suppliers coming into the
Let me ask
process.
you something. What's the weakness that you see with that setup?
There's variability in international. In that situation, that was Western Europe. And you might be asking for a different reason, but I'll tell you, our variability was 14 of those countries, they have 14 different scoring models. They all have different strengths in what they provide, right? Some are good in trade lines, some do well financial statements, and so the depth of data varies. That was some of the challenges.
Right. We implemented a model that pretty much vets a vendor preliminary. We call it a vendor approval process, which has quadrant on quality, safety, compliance, and the financial quadrant, right? The problem is that with business intelligence, it's only part of the piece. It's a very important piece, but it's part of it. Sometimes we know that the financials might be bogus, because obviously if the business intelligence is showing us multiple lawsuits, tax liens, tax assessments, bounce checks, things like that, and your financials look golden, yeah, I don't think so. Or on the flip side, if they have some issues, but they're not material, but you get their financials, they're audited by EY, as an example, a reputable, and they're unqualified. It is to a GAAP standard or international reporting financial standards. You have some reliability, right? So you have to put everything together. And the reason I asked you, what kind of risk do you see with this, is that our vendor goes in there and puts their financial data in there. And many times I might have Procurement Brazil calling me, hey, Alvin, I don't know why it's scored red. It's wrong. How do you know? Their EBITDA can't be lower than their EBIT. Their current assets can't be lower than their total assets, okay? They inputted the data incorrectly. So there's nothing like getting the information yourself and validating it, okay? Otherwise, that's like having the fox guard the hen house. So, no, I'm not saying that they'll do it, but I'd like to hear from Mike, because Mike has a different perspective on this.
So this is how I know Alvin. First of all, I represent the Credit Management Association. And what that means is that we support business credit managers or the business credit function in B2B businesses. And that function's sole purpose is to manage the risk of credit sales, collect receivables, ultimately maximize cash flow, and manage the risk of doing business on credit terms. Okay? So why in the world would a business credit person, and these guys represent business credit too, among other things, be at a global supply chain management conference? Okay? Well, this is actually how I met Alvin. Nestle USA has been a member of CMA for a long time, but we know Nestle through our connection with the business credit function, where people like Alvin, credit managers, evaluate the credit risk of their customers, so downstream. Alvin, a couple of years ago, introduced me to this concept, this crazy concept that, there's a lot of risk in the supply chain. And who better than the credit managers in a company whose job it is to manage, evaluate and manage risk, to help procurement evaluate their suppliers from a risk perspective. Well, that's not really part of our world. And he gave a really great presentation at another credit function a couple of years ago, where he basically pitched this idea that that the credit management function in a company is really best positioned to help procurement evaluate and manage that credit risk. And he started out by asking the audience, there were about 100 credit managers in the audience. Any credit managers here, by the way? I didn't think so. Okay.
By the way, these are Fortune 500 companies in the U.S.
Yeah, so these are the top-level credit executives with their companies like Nestle, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, companies like that. And 100 credit managers in the room, and he asked the question, how many of you are being asked by your procurement departments to help evaluate your suppliers? And I figured just a couple of hands would go up, about half of the room. And it was really interesting because this is a new trend that we're seeing, again, from a credit perspective, that procurement is realizing that their main function or their main interest is in making sure that a supplier can get that product from A to B. The credit function is concerned with, is there likely to be, or what is the likelihood that there's going to be a disruption in that delivery of that product from A to B? How likely is that supplier to not perform for whatever reason? And then we started getting into this idea that, well, if this is a growing trend where the credit department is being asked by procurement to help evaluate suppliers, what kind of process is in place with these companies in order to do that? Now, Nestle is very, very unusual in that Alvin is a credit manager, but he's also He was a credit manager. Now he manages global credit risk evaluation at Nestle. That is the only dedicated team that I'm aware of in any company that all they do is evaluate vendor risk. Most of our members are being asked to not only evaluate the risk of their customers, but now they're being asked to evaluate the risk of their suppliers. And the big point, the big takeaway that we've gotten through this process of getting these companies together, we've formed a group of credit managers who are sharing best practices now with the help of Alvin sort of leading the way with Nestle's model, is we're realizing that it's very risky certainly to have a big customer or some big customers not pay on terms or at all.
Or go bankrupt.
Or go bankrupt, yeah. It's a much, much bigger issue if you have a major supplier or a critical supplier disrupt, gum up the whole works because they cannot perform, they cannot deliver those critical items. So this is kind of an opportunity for the credit world to basically support procurement. And, Mark, I'd love to hear if you have any, exposure to this in your work, where the credit department is, the risk managers.
Or the risk manager to
Yeah.
that point. It doesn't necessarily have to be a credit department. One of the things that I found is that a credit or a risk professional doesn't understand procurement and supply chain. Supply chain professionals and procurement are good at contracts and everything, but they have a difficulty understanding that risk and the financial aspect. And I have an MBA with one of the concentrations is on supply chain management, but it was very high level. And I needed to understand how supply chain worked at a more granular level, which is why I got into this program in the first place. And I realized there's a gap. So I didn't understand procurement, but now I understand the business better, so I understand my customer better. And those are the best practices that we're trying to basically gap between the two disciplines. But there's a lot more to risk than just the financial and the vendor. And after Mark makes his comments, I would like to see Dr. Sosic talk about other areas of risk. But Mark, please.
So it's interesting that you make that comment. So we're in a very different paradigm at Southern California Edison than the paradigms of most of the parties around here. We are a regulated monopoly, so we have an obligation to serve. We go out and build infrastructure. So we really have two sides of our procurement. One is infrastructure, and the other is buying energy and capacity to supply customers. And I think in that space, it's interesting that you make those comments because our risk group is really the core of how we evaluate it. A lot of products, particularly early on in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was almost all traded products. So the counterparty risk was actually how much credit approval did we have with the counterparty. You know, really walked and talked like the financial market. So how much credit counterparty you have with a credit, what are your trading limits, what are your daily limits, what are your position limits, all those types of things we cover. That's kind of the easy credit perspective from my standpoint. That's the short term, because the contracting in that space is usually only a short period of time. The more difficult is we're now signing 10 and 20-year contracts with people, and different to the problem you raised with Hunjin, we actually have a number of projects that supply to us that their parent company is bankrupt. But all of the projects, because the way energy projects are generally structured, each project is its own special purpose entity. And so each of those entities are generally, once they've built the asset, they're very liquid. So it's a very different paradigm. But I think your idea of the risk manager being core, I mean, it's been in our energy procurement for quite a number of years, and the risk group has been in our regular procurement more around credit products and, okay, this is the risk of this vendor, so what kind of security do we need from that vendor? What kind of holdback do we want in the contract? Things like that. So we've done that for quite a while, but I think it was really peaked off by, you know, all the upheaval in the financial markets and really the traded products of power and gas being the key ones for us, that you see all this volatility.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the 10-year contracts and all this. Nestle is trying to convert most of its energy consumption to renewable energy, so we're contracting a lot with like those wind turbines. And what I found is that a parent company, they'll set up a shell corporation specifically to build the turbines for a specific plant. And there's risk with that because the parent company has no recourse, or there is no recourse to the parent company if, let's say, you have a claim. And an interesting thing happened. I got a call from, I can't remember where in Latin America. The head of procurement calls me and says, "I have a problem. We accidentally double paid a vendor at a tune of $2.5 million. Now we're calling them and they don't want to pay us. They're using every excuse." Okay. You know, the threshold for North America is $4 million. So that means any vendor under $4 million, we don't look at. Because for North America, we're talking about, what, $20 billion in annual purchases? So I got about 1,000 vendors that make up that 80% of spend, right? But anyways, I tell them, let me take a look at it. Great, it's a shell corporation, good luck. So, you know, that's another risk. There's a supply chain risk and there's a financial risk. So, but I would like to hear from Dr. Sosic and see what she has to say about her perspective on risk, because it'll be different.
Yeah, when I first look at the members of the panel, I was, what am I doing here with all the kind of people dealing with credit risk and so.
You're here to keep me in line.
Okay, so I'm teaching 3 classes here at Marshall. One is supply chain management, one is sustainable supply chain, and one is sourcing and supplier management. And risks come in all of those kind of different aspects of the business. So one area, one industry in which I think risk is quite big of an issue is automotive, and specifically because they have very tiered structures, so that sometimes it's very difficult to figure out who are actually your suppliers. And example we do in supply chain class is looking at the impact of Japanese earthquake on Honda Canada, because Honda Canada was kind of, okay, they were upset that something happened in Japan, but they thought about 91% of products sold in Canada are manufactured in North America, so they should be fine, they should be safe, until they figure out that some critical components actually made in Japan, and not only that, but they were single-sourced. So they had a single source in Japan, and they were out of business because they were located kind of very close to the epicenter. So it's kind of something that is very difficult to predict, difficult to assess, and always kind of looking at how to deal. So they did manage to find some ways to kind of ease the situation, shaving production, kind of not putting some parts in the car and replacing it later for free, kind of to keep the production going. And the other example that I like to use to start my sourcing class is one that many students are familiar with, which is Takata Corporation, which is kind of responsible for 14 deaths now because of the exploding airbags and shrapnels that kind of go to people. And so now the problem with this is that currently they have about almost $200 million set apart to settle lawsuits and problems that come from this. And this is kind of not really, they're not able to cover it with their profits and with their revenues. And why is this a problem is because they are providing 30% of airbags sold kind of worldwide. And so if kind of they go bankrupt, we will not really have airbags and seat belts and many other things that they are providing. So there are currently kind of two different options under consideration, either Japanese automakers to invest in Takata, which they kind of don't seem too eager to do because of potential future expenses, lawsuits, and things that they might be forced then to be responsible for. And alternative is if they don't do that, then some foreign automakers may do that, and then they are losing a source of their product. So it's kind of industry which has a lot of potential issues and risks that come from very different sources, not just looking at what is your current performance, but something that can be rather unpredictable. So one of the reasons that Takata was in this situation was just looking at cutting costs. So they were at the position in which they had to compete with other suppliers, and they were trying to find a way to reduce cost, and they found it by using a very volatile component in building all their airbags. Now, similar thing, cost cutting caused a lot of problems in other industries as well because of the competition. We have longer kind of global supply chains, less visibility, and kind of it can be difficult to predict things. So, example that we also do when we start sourcing classes, similar, looking at Apple and some of the issues they had with Wintec and Foxconn. So Wintec is a company that was responsible for cleaning the glass on iPads, and in order to speed up the process and cut the cost, they used toxic chemical because it was evaporating 3 times faster than alcohol, which caused injuries to many of the workers. Foxconn did not provide proper ventilation in the iPad factories, which led to explosions in which people died. However, we don't really hear much talk about Apple and how they deal with their vendors, and we hear a lot about automakers and what's happening there. So sometimes it's really kind of how people feel about their products, how much they love their products, and what are they willing to pay attention to, and what are they not willing to pay attention to.
You know, as I hear Dr. Gray talk, I remember how much I learned in her classes. So I didn't know much about supply chain. But she mentioned a couple of very interesting points. Single source, sole source. I thought it was the same thing, and actually it's not. One is when you have many suppliers, but you opt to use 1 or 2. One of the things that you see in the past decade is a lot of companies consolidated their supply base so they could leverage size, get better pricing, but it increased the risk. Now, when you have like single sourcing, it means that you don't have an alternate vendor, period. I mean, I deal with that, let's say, milk collectors in Venezuela. You know, it's like, there's no other ones. They collect from these little farms, okay? Or a technology, or what do you call intellectual property on a process, you know? The other thing you mentioned is, you know, like consolidation. And we're gonna have another slide, but before I go to the next slide, consolidation, we look at it from 2 perspectives. Consolidation or concentration of customers and concentration of suppliers. Both of them are very risky. You lose a high percentage of your sales, it'll hurt you. You lose a significant source of procurement, it's gonna hurt you too. And this is where the business intelligence comes in. And I'm gonna let Scott talk about this, because business intelligence, you think, oh, they're paying their bills or they're not paying their bills. It's a little bit more than that. It's not the end solution, but it helps you understand what this business is, because one of the things that it has, how many locations they have, where are they, what business are they in, are they vertically integrated or not, and then we go into the financial stuff, which is the stuff I love. So, but then, you know, that's how we find out, hey, where are they? Because some of these reports are like, hey, they're susceptible to tsunami. because they're concentrated in the tsunami area or earthquake area or geopolitical unrest. So why don't you talk about it, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting topic. I mean, we're talking about international data for the most part, right? So I wrote down some notes from Biren Gandhi. I think he spoke right after lunch, right? And he quoted Capgemini, and I think it was interesting. The use of technology for radical improvement, performance, which might be translated in his opinion of top-line revenue performance, just growing, and then, performance was profit. And then reach, which really meant reaching other markets and growing. And not to get too far off topic, but the way we look at business intelligence is really a way of helping other economies that are somewhat stagnant grow. The more insight that we can provide for both either in the supply chain, supplier and vendor risk, the more likely US-based companies are going to feel good about going into those countries and making some business decisions, right? So, example, we're currently working with also a high-tech company in Northern California. They have a credit team and a whole supply chain team down in South America, but they feel a little uncomfortable giving them full control over the decisions. So what we're doing, we're pumping all that data up into a model in Northern California, which is going to crunch that data, and it's going to let them kind of have oversight as to business growth, opening manufacturing plants, keeping an eye on the supply chain component. And as a result, they'll be able to hopefully, and that's just Brazil, but they can grow that market responsibly. Whereas in the past, what you may have seen is no decision, right? So if you look at Australia, a lot of South American countries, a lot of African countries, there's some potential there. And American companies are struggling for growth. I think we've all maximized the developed countries. It's these undeveloped countries that business intelligence is really going to help grow a little bit. So what's in that business intelligence? As I think I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of variability.
Hit and miss. No.
It's hit and miss. I mean,
So
I want Chris to talk a little bit about it too.
Yeah,
because
Chris,
has got
you want to talk about that?
But
Absolutely.
Mexico. Let me just cover what Mexico, and we were talking about it last night. It gives us heartache. Mexico, as an example, to get credit on a business in Mexico, a Mexican owner, I believe, has to go down to an office somewhere and sign away their rights to allow other people to see what's going on. So we get requests all the time for business intelligence on companies in Mexico, and we struggle with it. They've come up with a pretty good system where I don't know if it's automated or real time. But think about that. If you're a business and you're trying to grow that market, that's really the key component. Having a very sound credit infrastructure along with good business intelligence is really the cornerstone of the good economy.
Before Chris starts, you touched on something really important. There's a difference between a public company or a company with public debt and a private company. Public companies, all day long, you can get financials. You have enough understanding of the financial trend and conditions, you can figure it out. Okay, it's also important to get the initial business intelligence. There's things called like the family tree. Sometimes, I might come across a company, well, I never heard of this company, and ended up being part of Cargill. Or they could be part of Toyota or Pepsi or Coke. It's a subsidiary or a joint venture. It changes everything. So that's the importance of the family tree, okay? And especially when we're drawing contracts, there's no assets at this level. Get the parent, or at least the immediate parent, if not the global ultimate, to be part of the contract negotiation. But on the private ones, I have a lot of relationships with CFOs and CEOs of these companies. Well, I'll tell you a real story very quickly. I get one of my head buyers of cocoa and coffee call me. Actually, they included me on an email. It was a string of emails going all over the world. It's a $100 million a year contract. And they're saying, we need to get out of this vendor. We hear rumors that they're going to go under. So the head vendor in this email said, hey, wait a minute. Alvin's team just reviewed this vendor 6 months ago. He said they were fine. Now you're saying that they're going to go under? So I said, include Alvin. So I get the email. I'm like, first thing I'm thinking is I hope my analyst didn't screw up. So I look it up and everything is fine, right? So in the meantime, these guys are like, we need to pull out, and it's like, it's going to the top. So I pick up the phone, I call the CFO, I call the cell, Yeah, I keep records of all that stuff. It's important that you keep records. I tell them, hey, I need a favor. I need you to send me your year-to-date financials like now, because our head procurement folks are talking to your CEO, and you probably haven't heard of it yet, but we want to pull out. I need to tell them that everything is good. There's no need for it. So did something happen? Did your production explode? Did something happen? You know, do you have like a class action asbestos lawsuit that just happened that I'm not aware of? He's like petrified. He's like within 5 minutes, I have all the financials and everything year to date. So I get back to procurement. It's like, hey, these guys are fine. Maybe you're dealing with a subsidiary, but the European unit is fine. The American unit is fine. The parent company is fine financially. So what exactly rumors are you hearing? I mean, there's some subsidiaries here, specifically one in South Africa, that we hadn't looked at because the spend was very low. It turns out that that's the one with the problem, and it's not even an affiliate. Okay, well, actually, I take it back. It's not a subsidiary, but it's affiliated because this company owns a minority interest in it. So that company, we're buying $2 million a year. So that means the $98 million that we're buying in cocoa from this particular vendor is fine, it's safe. So had we pulled out, it would have cost us like $5 million. So it's a cost avoidance as well. It's not just about identifying the ones that can hurt you, but also those deals that make sense, that save money. We're lean, we're looking for, cutting costs out. Sometimes we walk away from business opportunities because it looks bad, but we don't fully understand what's going on. And I rely on these guys, the data that they give me, especially when I'm looking at family trees and who's who in the zoo. And so, Chris, please.
Yeah, and as Alvin was saying, I mean, it is very easy to get this type of data on public companies. The tricky part is, in the US at least, is the private companies. Obviously, every company has different filing laws, different types of data are available in different countries. Including the family tree, the business intel reports also include things like payment trends. If they're getting slower and slower on their payments, it's probably a warning sign that something's going on. Suits, liens that we were talking about, anybody that's after them in the court system. If they get millions of dollars worth of tax liens, again, how is that going to affect their business? And then how is that going to affect you guys? Are they viable? Are they going to be around for the length of your contract? Or are you going to sign a $100 million contract with a supplier only to find out that they're going bankrupt 6 months later? It is critical that you guys know that this business is going to be around for the long haul.
So going back to the points that we have on the slide, I think we talked about identifying risk. We haven't quite talked about the impact yet. It's going to be on the next slide. Mitigating is a different situation for each event. It could be as simple as having an alternate vendor. I can tell you a situation where I knew that was a vendor that we had that was going to go under inside of 6 months because of the cash burn cycle. Didn't have enough cash. At the way that we're burning cash, there's a difference between cash flow and P&L or income statement, by the way. So I talked to the buyer and I tell him, hey, so you need to bail. He goes, he says, well, these guys happen to be right next to the factory. All right. So he says, the next vendor's like 200 miles away. I got it. Tell you what, build up inventory for 2 weeks, continue to use this one, make sure that you develop the other vendor. It's already approved. You have to go through compliance, safety, and all that other stuff. And when this one fails, it'll take you 2 weeks to transition over. You won't have a disruption. And at least you continue to get the lower cost because you don't have to pay the transportation of 200 miles. You have that product right there. Or we might have a vendor that is actually located inside of one of our factories, okay, which happens too. So there's always a contingency strategy. A contingency strategy could be moving to another vendor, like I said. It could be, it's always about sourcing. Or it could be about mitigating that risk. Does it make sense? You want to escrow the blueprints. You want to escrow the source code. You always have a contingency. The thing that is dangerous is when you don't have one. That's when we have the stoppage. And like you mentioned, like Mike mentioned, you have a disruption. I had one of my markets, one of my CFOs in one of my markets call me. It's like, look, we had a disruption, 8 months that we couldn't get our product on our shelves. 2 years later, we still not even close to the market share that we had before. So, but control, you know, it's all about how good your mitigation or your contingency strategies are, and understanding, you know, where you have your risk. Which ones are the ones that really represent a risk, and which ones are the ones that don't? And there's a difference between supply chain risk or disruption and a business risk. So business risk, machinery. Typically, when you're buying machines for a line, I don't care if it's a packaging machine or a repack machine or a sorting machine, you're paying up to 90% of that machine up front before it's even installed, okay? And I've had situations where the machinery companies come back, we need more money. What do you mean you need more money? So, and we're talking about millions of dollars. Yeah, well, because they get new orders in, they're using that money to keep the lights on. So if there's a disruption in orders, they run out of money they could fold. So I said, fine, you know, but I want the blueprints, okay? Because if I'm gonna hire, you know, an industrial engineer company to come and fix it, I want to make sure that they don't have to reverse engineer this thing, especially if I'm using it in 20 lines and in 5 different factories, you know, so that's a way of mitigating. The contingency, the supply chain policy. We actually have a policy in place now that, alongside with checking the quality, checking the compliance, checking the sustainability, check the financial capacity of this vendor. Another problem I've experienced is, we're going to sign a $50 million contract with this company. Hey, fellas, their sales are only $10 million a year. They don't have the capacity. And then I talked to their CFO or CEO. Oh, yeah, we're going to outsource it. Oh, really? How can you guarantee me the quality and the you know, that I'm going to get my shipments in? Or another one, and these are all real events. So, tell me, so if we're going to sign a $100 million contract with you guys, you're going to need at least $20 million in working capital intensity to manage the raw materials, the WIP, the finished goods, the terms that you're going to give us. Where are you going to get the money? You don't have the money. So maybe it's a conscious decision that we go in there and we bail them out. That's fine.